Hello, everyone. We're going to start this week by talking about education and debt. So, just to give you an idea of where we're going, we're going to start by talking about education and inequality and how those two are related. Then we're going to move on to talking about early education. I think it's really important that we always remember that, like, whatever inequalities exist at the level of higher education are kind of just amplified. Those inequalities amplify kind of the inequalities in earlier education in elementary school, middle school, and high school. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that. Then we're going to move on to talk about how college affordability has become what it is in the U.S. And then we're going to finally wrap up by talking about all these proposals going around for student loan forgiveness, which have been really popular as of late. So, on to education and inequality. Education is human capital, for lack of a better term. It enhances the productivity of people. So if people can earn higher incomes because they're more productive, then education could be seen as a tool to help reduce inequality. Because if people who are would be lower productivity receive more education, they'll be more productive, earn higher incomes, and that helps inequality. But education is just one small part of kind of society's response to inequality. It can improve it, but as we've discussed previously, it can't solve it. There are other systemic issues that keep kind of the income distribution the way it is. But we should probably care about equality of opportunity, even from a pure market efficiency standpoint. Even Adam Smith believed that the vast majority of the differences in productivities between people was the result of different opportunities that they had. His example was the philosopher and the common street porter loading bags onto a cart. Like, these two people just had very different educational opportunities growing up, and they could have just as easily ended up in each other's shoes, if not just by chance. And so, if we can have equality of access, then maybe some people that would otherwise be low productivity could become higher productivity just by being given the opportunity to gain an education. So, there are significant differences in outcomes between people at kind of the lower end of the income distribution and the upper end, and there's significant barriers to access. So let's start by talking about different outcomes just at the very early end with early education. And so there's a big discrepancy or a big difference between the performance of low socioeconomic status students and high socioeconomic status students. So what do I mean by socioeconomic status? So that is a kind of composite measure that includes a variety of things. And so it typically includes income, it includes parents' education, and I believe some examples include race. So it's a kind of an index, right? And so they rank people according to this index. And students who are on the lower end of this measure have a worse starting point. So they start off with worse reading and math scores, and they also start off with worse kind of what are called kind of non-cognitive skills, like kind of intangible skills that can't be easily measured, that are often evaluated subjectively by a kindergarten teacher. And also, socioeconomic status statistically strongly predicts educational attainment. And so this should concern us, right? Because if we do have equality of opportunity, socioeconomic status shouldn't be a strong predictor of educational attainment if we assume that, humans have just about as good a chance as any other human, independent of their income level and their socioeconomic status, of having, the ability to become high productivity. So one very important discrepancy between kind of the high and low socioeconomic status students early on is pre-K attendance. So students that go to pre-K perform better in elementary school, and this effect persists through middle school. And more research is being done to see if that effect persists even into high school. But students that go to pre-K are less likely to be held back and more likely to take honor courses in middle school. They also, through elementary school, score higher in mathematics, though the effect is less persistent with reading because the idea is that there's so many other influences going on, like all the media and people around you speaking affect your reading and language skills. And, as I mentioned already, higher socioeconomic status students are more likely to have gotten access to pre-K. But yeah, so the methodology of this study was they looked at 2 cohorts of kindergarten students. These are large national cohorts. One was in the early 90s from the 90-91 school year, and one was in the 2010-2011 school year. And then they looked at different performance between high and low socioeconomic status students within each of those cohorts, and then they compared those 2 cohorts to get some idea of how this gap may have changed over time. And so the gaps in reading and math have remained about the same from the 90s to the 2010s, according to this study among kindergartners. So at least it's not becoming worse, and this is also during a time period where we had the Great Recession, and so that could also be playing a role that confounds this kind of idea of how this has evolved over time. But importantly, just as true in the 90s and in the 2010s, families that are in low socioeconomic status can do certain things to help close this achievement gap. So these things include having higher expectations of academic performance on part of the parents, pre-K participation, books at home. There's a whole other, pile of things that parents can do and that the study measured. And it appears that as time goes on, so in the later cohort, parents are doing more to help their children succeed educationally. But sadly, while parents are doing more later on, the effect of those interventions has declined over time. So if you were a low socioeconomic status kindergartner in the 90s, going to pre-K helped you a lot more than it did in 2010 and 2011. So this means what we can take from this, in addition to the fact that these interventions, while they can reduce the gap, cannot eliminate it. Because there's that remainder of gap, we can draw from this that there's something unmeasured and inherent about low socioeconomic status that affects educational outcomes. And we also don't know exactly how long that achievement gap hangs around. And so these are 2 things to keep in mind, where we don't really know how this follows students all the way into high school and college. But the point I wanted to establish with this is there are inequalities at the very beginning of formal education in the United States. So, moving ahead to higher education, I had you read that Senate testimony, and so to understand college affordability, the reading asserts that we need to understand the net prices students pay, the other expenses that they must pay while they're in school, the aid available to students, and how big student debt is. So, college affordability and value. So college cannot be made affordable if the values of degrees that they grant are low. So, for instance, if you go to one of these kind of shady for-profit schools and get a degree from them, that degree may not actually demand a college wage premium in the labor market. And that means that you don't get the higher productivity measured in terms of wages that you expected to. And so then maybe you're burdened with all of the student loans you took out. So, in addition to that, not finishing provides little to no value. So not finishing provides little to no value. And so the big problem here are people that are not receiving that wage premium but already had to pay for some or all of college. Another important thing to keep in mind is that the average payoff to college education is quite high, but the variance is wide. So some people see huge pay increases and some people see almost no pay increase, and then everyone else is kind of sitting in the middle. It's relatively normal distribution. But because this variance is very wide, that means that some people can get unexpectedly weak labor market outcomes that they wouldn't have foresaw, and then they're kind of stuck not being able to pay their loans. And this is important because most people have to borrow at least some to attend college. So let's talk about kind of the bundle of aid that's available. So there's the federal Pell Grants, which were $35 billion in 2010, somewhat smaller subsequently because college attendance was very high in 2010 because people were still adapting in the wake of the Great Recession, retraining. And so I think it's around $26 billion in 2016 was the most recent number I found. And then institutional aid, so this would be grants that are provided by universities to their own students, is about as big as federal Pell Grants in 2010 and became relatively larger by 2016. I believe they were around $40 billion. There are also grants from private sources and scholarships. These are substantial in size, but it's hard to know their exact scale relative to all these others, just because the data is not there. And also 30% of all federal aid is veteran or active military aid. So this would be a separate thing from the Pell Grants. So this would be like your GI Bill stuff. So that's kind of like the view of what's out there. So that's how things are paid for. Well, what are they paying? They're paying the prices. Well, just kind of like healthcare, where there isn't just one price for a procedure, there's also not just one price for a college education. So kind of these measures that say tuition has tripled in 30 years have some meaningful value because they're talking about, well, it has increased far faster than inflation, but many students don't actually pay the prices that are being measured here. A lot of price discrimination occurs. So very few people pay the sticker price of education. I'm sure we've all, or at least those of us who are from the U.S., are all really familiar with the fact that if you go to a state college in your home state, it's far cheaper than if you go to a state college in another state. But also there's some price discrimination along the income distribution. Low-income students often receive a large portion of that institutional aid that I previously talked about. And this is an issue because low-income students may be making the decision to attend college or not based upon that high sticker price that they wouldn't actually pay. And so they may be making inefficient educational decisions in that sense. Just to kind of give you an idea of what those prices actually are, so these are the prices net of federal and institutional aid and on average. So for public 2-year colleges, so this would be like Salt Lake City Community College, the average is just over $8,000 a year. For a public 4-year university, so something like the U, the average is $15,000 a year. And for a private nonprofit 4-year college, so this would be, for example, something like Westminster, would be $27,000 a year. So it's also important to remember that students have to kind of live in that time, right? So they're still paying for housing and food and, whatever other things humans need to survive, healthcare, what have you. So non-tuition expenses are a major part of college expenses, and low-income students face these issues typically without parental support. Tuition and fees are only 40% of expenses for an undergrad at a 4-year public institution. So over 60% of their annual expenses are things that aren't tuition and fees. And so they take out loans. Average student debt levels are rising. 44 million people in the United States are in student debt. And importantly, student debt cannot be discharged in bankruptcy like other sorts of debts. This is actually a relatively recent change within the last 10 years. And as previously mentioned, most troubled are students that have high debt levels, but with degrees of questionable value or no degree at all. So that testimony I had you read was in support of reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. And so there's some very specific kind of policy points in there. One is to simplify the aid process so that it's just easier for people to apply. Make Pell Grants more predictable and reliable. So a lot of times whenever you're applying for Pell Grants as a student, you aren't exactly sure how much you're going to get until very close to the beginning of the semester. And so this makes it difficult to kind of plan and make your decisions. And this would all be after you've already made your choice of which institution you're attending. Another, and I think very important point in this, is to hold institutions accountable for student success and eliminate institutions with poor outcomes from federal aid programs. So basically, if your institution has a really low completion rate, or the degrees that they grant are not valuable in the labor market, you would not be able to receive federal aid. There are some concerns that I have there, for instance, more kind of cultural education places or what have you. But it's something to definitely consider to weed out kind of institutions that aren't actually helping their students, especially if they claim to be having good labor market outcomes, but in fact are not. Providing better information and guidance to students, this kind of goes along with making Pell Grants more predictable, give people the tools to make better decisions. And finally, improve the income-driven repayment system for student loans. Right now, there is a kind of number of different income-driven repayment systems that allow students to pay off their loans while paying less than the full balance. And this is one way that the federal government ensures students against these kind of weak labor market outcomes, is through saying, well, you got a crap job, sorry about that, we'll throw you a bone and you don't have to pay off all your student loans. And I think this is especially important given that student loans can't be discharged in bankruptcy. So this testimony was given, I believe, back in 2016, but the Higher Education Act is up for reauthorization again this year, so it's still policy relevant. So moving on from that, let's talk about these proposals floating around for student loan forgiveness. So you've seen from kind of Warren and Sanders this kind of universal across-the-board forgiveness. The Democrats have actually proposed a bill that would suspend all student loan payments until the national crisis is ended, but it would put a minimum amount of benefit or minimum amount of relief at $10,000 per person. This is basically kind of a scaled back version of full forgiveness, saying if you've got a federal student loan, we are going to cut your balance by $10,000. So this would eliminate the student debt balances for about 35% of borrowers, and it's also important to note that it's not the people with massive student debt that are most likely to default, but the people with very small balances in this kind of $10,000 range. So this would also kind of help eliminate kind of the debts of people who are most likely to default. So and student loan payments have already been suspended and they're not accruing additional interest during this time, and that was, I believe, an executive order. So let's think about some of the outcomes of this. One of the additional sources I added to this week's page talks about the macroeconomic effects of this sort of cancellation. And one way we can think about this as a selective but massive Keynesian stimulus package, right? Student debt can delay household formation, home purchases, and small business formation. And so these economists got together and did some macro modeling, and they argue that a complete forgiveness of all student debt balances would increase GDP, reduce the average employment rate, inflation would increase a little bit, interest rates would increase a little bit, the federal deficit would stay about the same, but state-level budgets would improve due to improved economic activity. I didn't want to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of that paper here, but I did want to at least mention it. Now, these are all good things, But something we might also want to consider about student debt forgiveness are its equality effects. Because forgiveness of student debt, if it were entirely across the board, could be regressive. It could redistribute income up the income distribution because poor people are less likely to go to college. So something to think about is, if forgiveness happens, should it be universal? Should it be means tested? And also, we have to balance this idea of, well, is the macro stimulus effect more important than the inequality implications? And I don't have a clear answer for you. These are just things that you should also keep in mind. So just wrapping up, students with low socioeconomic status have a harder time with education right from the start. Efforts can be made that improve this, but can't eliminate this achievement gap. College affordability is really dependent on the value of degrees, and so we got to think about that. And whenever we're talking about college affordability, student debt is most problematic for these people that end up with these low-value degrees. And finally, student debt cancellation would provide a macro stimulus, but could have worrying implications about inequality, and we need to balance these two aspects of the proposal. All right, I think that's all I got for this one, and thanks.